To introduce our speaker today is Yeji Kim, who is our representative from the Bio Club. If you are interested in becoming an officer in the Bio Club, please consider it and do so.
Hi, good evening. So I'll be here to introduce Dr. Ross today, who is our speaker. He is the director of the Center for Creation Studies at Liberty University. He is also a geologist, so he'll be sharing with us how studying rocks and sediments can relate to the creationist perspective as a scientist. In his free time, he loves to spend time mostly with his 4 children at home, who are, I believe, 5, 7, 9, and 11 years old. Yes. And that's all I have to say about him, so I'll take it over.
Thank you very much. Thank you. All right. So let me just pull up the first of the slides here and get ourselves up and running. Thank you very much. It is a distinct pleasure to be back on the campus of Southern Adventist University. I was here 12 years ago, and actually I was here just this morning, so I'm back. But today I'd like to talk about fossils. This is the subject that has always fascinated me ever since I was a small child. And ever since I was a small child, I was also one who wanted to follow the Lord. And those twin passions brought me to the creation-evolution debate quite early on. I remember being as young as 9 and being in a playroom at my house and trying to sort out what I would believe about dinosaurs. Because it seemed like the dinosaur books that I was reading, this is long before there were internet videos, but things have changed. The dinosaur books, actual books with paper, weird, seem to differ in their advocate position about what dinosaurs were and when they were compared to what the biblical records seem to be thinking about. And I didn't know the types of theological argumentation, and I didn't know the terms that important, smart people use when they start thinking about different alternative views of Genesis. I just remember being a kid saying, how do I understand this? How do I try and put these things together? How do I make sense of the world from what I'm learning of it and from what I'm learning of He who made it, and put these together? And my initial thought at that young age of 9 was, well, God's talking about a young earth, and He's talking about a global flood. And I'm sure that the dinosaur books have a lot of truth in them, but it also seems that they must be mistaken about a few things. After all, they don't claim to be written by God. So I'm going to say they probably have a few mistakes in them. And that began my long journey into areas of creation and evolution, because having these twin passions of God and fossils, there seemed to be no way to avoid it. So you might as well embrace that kind of conflict and seek resolution, seek learning, seek the wisdom that God has given us in being able to do things in a manner somewhat like Him, right? He gave us His image, and He's given us the ability to think, to rationalize, to discover, to find joy in His creation. So today's talk is called mostly Dry Bones, about what the fossil record can teach us about Earth history. I teach at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia, where I'm the director of the Center for Creation Studies. My area of interest is I teach earth science classes, paleontology classes, creation evolution courses, and then anything else that somebody wants me to teach so that I can keep my job. So whatever that happens to be. But those are the areas of my greatest interest and passion. And Dr. Snyder made sure that I had to remind people that I also have a business that my wife and I started a couple of years ago, creating science supplies for specifically Christian educators, whether those are homeschool or private school. And I'll talk a little bit more about Cornerstone Educational Supply at the very end, but you aren't required to make any purchases before you leave. So, when we take a look at a scriptural record of the book of Genesis and the question of how do we understand the flood, there's a lot of different ways that we can find argumentation for a young earth within the pages of Scripture and for a global flood within the pages of Scripture. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these. In fact, I'm just going to talk about one, because this one particular area, as we can see that Noah's flood is global in scope for both humans and animals, has a direct bearing then on the fossil record. The other ones have some different areas, but if I was going to be giving a different talk about other parts of creation, I'd be going through some of these other ones. But today, I want to talk a little bit about Noah's flood as the context that then brings us into a broader discussion of fossils. Then again, I kind of wonder why it is that professors like me talk about us having a discussion one evening when I'm the one who does all the talking. So I'll try and avoid making ridiculous comments like we're having a discussion. Hopefully we'll have some discussion afterwards with your questions. So, what we find in Genesis chapter 6 is that God is so pained by the condition of humanity that sin and violence have risen to a point at which the whole world was filled with violence, is what the scripture tells us, that God's heart was pained, and he had decided that it was going to be time to end the experiment of humanity. The old King James says it this way. It says, "The Lord repented in his heart that he had made man." Other versions of the Bible, other translations say that God was sorry that he had done it. No matter how we parse it, in a theologically accurate way, this is a damning critique of humanity. God has decided punishment and death, and the end of humanity is the only real option for the world at that time. And after hearing that statement from God about the pain in his heart and how bad things had gotten, there's another verse that says, "But Noah found grace in God's sight." And it's because of the grace of that one man that you and I are here today. And it's because of the grace of that one man that you and I are not only here today, but we can investigate the world and discover the things that happened during the flood. Because while the Bible provides us with some information about it, a good deal, it certainly isn't enough to satisfy the curiosity of science people who keep asking more questions every time they find something. So one of the things that tells me that the flood narrative in the book of Genesis, which is Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9, is referring to a global flood. One of them is the density of the universal language that is used in it. Now, if I want to draw your attention to something on this PowerPoint slide, audience participation part here, what could I do to draw attention to something in particular up here? What might I do using PowerPoint? Highlight, underline, what else? Bold, colors, emojis? Oh, please no, right? Can't wait till somebody comes out with a new translation of the Bible based in emojis. It will happen. It will happen, but there are special places theologically for them. Anyway. We have at our disposal, because we are a literate society that is used to reading books and seeing presentations and reading all the time, we have a lot of ways at our disposal for bringing forth an understanding of emphasis. So my title is a slightly different color from the rest of this, and I have a pointer, right? I can say density. We could, focus on that for a moment. But when you're talking about the ancient Israelites, who did not read and write as a normal part of their day-to-day life, most of them, right? This is why we have terms like scribes. These were people whose job it was to write things down because they could. Most Israelis wandering through the early Hebrews, some of them could write, certainly, but they didn't do it very often. My sister is an Old Testament professor at Liberty University, and she told me something interesting just a couple of months ago about when you go to ancient Israel and you find inscriptions made by ancient Israelis on some place, it looks like children's handwriting. These are adults, but it looks like children's handwriting, which tells us they're not used to doing this frequently. Their handwriting is quite poor, generally speaking. So if you're not going to have bold, if you're not going to have underline, if you're not going to have flashing colors or things like that, how do you get people's attention? It's through repetition. You have to do what your mother did. You've got to say it over and over and over again. My job growing up was to take out the trash. When did I take out the trash? Every day. How many days is that, Mom? Every day that ends in day. No exceptions. Every day. I had some rather painful losing arguments in junior high where I attempted to exert my own level of rationality into this, that the one lone cleaned out can at the bottom of the trash really didn't need to go out until sometime tomorrow. I lost these arguments not because of rationality, but because of brute force. My mom was my mom, and I wanted to live at home. So I take out the garbage. But I learned to take out the garbage every day because my mom told me over and over again. When we take a look at the pages of Scripture, printed out here is Genesis 6 through 9, circled are all of the instances of universal terms. There are over 60 instances of the Hebrew word that we translate as all, every, and everything. Over 60. There are also several universal exclusionary terms, like none, that are in here as well, to get us the idea that as we go through here, this is God promising that everything will die. Genesis chapter 7, starting right here, is everything does die, and all the mountains are being covered by water, and the floodwaters continue to increase, and then everything is gone, and only Noah was left. Then God remembered Noah and all the beasts, and then there's nothing over here for a little while because this is when the floodwaters go down. They're not destroying everything, it's already destroyed. They're not flooding everything, they've already done that. And so we have this little quiet spot where there's no universal language, and then Noah gets off of the boat, and God promises that he will never do this again, and he promises that he will do that never again for everybody, not only the humans, but also the animals. And so we have a bunch of universal terminology there as well. And so when you see that much universal terminology, we're not talking about hyperbole. This isn't like saying, I've got a million things to do today, right? Unless you're talking about subcellular processes, the answer is probably no. And the cell biology majors laugh. So what we see is God uses repetition to provide emphasis. This is exactly what we'd expect. We also see that when God promises that he is never going to bring forth a flood of waters, the Hebrew word here is mabul, it's a special word only for this event in all of Scripture, that he makes the promise that he will never do this again, and he makes it to all of the humans and the animals, the 8 people and the entire ark full of creatures. That is a common covenant between me, God, and all flesh. The Hebrew word here is basar, and that word basar means meaty stuff in this case. All flesh is not just like a muscle, it's life. So the flood narrative tends to lend itself. We could go into much, much more detail, but my topic today is not the flood narrative. I talked a bit about that earlier in an origins class. But my topic here today is about fossils within the flood. So the flood narrative itself lends us to a global view, and the text is very difficult to reconcile with older views that either posit some sort of localized flood that affects people because people haven't gone very far. If you take a look at the distribution of people, that's not going to work. It also doesn't lend itself to what is currently rather a fashionable way of looking at the text within some evangelical circles, that really the flood is a common mythology in the ancient Near East that God is using in order to convey his superiority over the other gods of the area. But it's not really something that was based in history, it's just a common mythology of the area. That doesn't seem to be the way that the Bible is presenting its case here. So you all got a handout, and this is a geological timeline. This is the sort of thing that geologists use all the time. When we think about rocks, we think about them with these pretty colors. We think about them as gray and black and things. But if you go through the science building, you'll see similar colors. Blue, green, and yellow, or tannish, brown, reflecting the types of colors that geologists use to assign different parts of the geological record. Now, this geological record was built prior to Darwin's writing The Origin of Species. The idea that we had these different layers that each had their own groups of organisms in them had been recognized in the early 1800s, and by the time Darwin wrote The Origin of Species and published in 1859, this column was pretty much complete. There were a couple of places where they were bickering as to whether or not one unit should be 2 or something, but the basic structure was already there. I have my own particular approach as to how I think the flood is connected to this. When you're looking at this, basically this stuff in the middle, all these funny names, are the data. These are the layers of rock that have fossils within them that are in stacked assemblages in various places around the world. And on either side, left and right, are possible interpretations of that data. So we've got the data of the world. It's not like the evolutionists have their data and creationists have their data, and it's a matter of whose pile is better. The world is the Lord's. and the fullness thereof is his. So that means that evolutionists and creationists both get to play in God's world. Which means that when, excuse me, an evolutionist discovers something of interest to me, I don't think that, oh man, the evolutionists have that. No, they found something God made. Neat. And you got to say that with that kind of junior high-ish sort of, lilt there. Neat, right? It's cool. It's awesome. Because it's something that we didn't know God did that now we do. But there are obviously different ways of interpreting, because my evolutionary colleagues think that the Earth's geological history is a record of 4.6 billion years up to the present. I don't think the Earth is that old. I think the Earth is only thousands of years, and so some of that geology was formed during the Creation Week period, some of it was formed during Noah's flood, and some of it was formed after the flood. And different creationists have different interpretations of where to put these boundaries, and since I'm speaking, it's mine and I win. No, but there are different interpretations, and that's good too, actually. If creationists disagree with each other about where to put boundaries, what that means is there's more to discover of God's world. And the more we discover, the more unity we will eventually have. The data will help us along the way. We got to have the eyes to see them and the ears to hear it right, but at the same time, keep finding, keep digging, keep looking. Picture becomes a little more clear. So what about those fossils that are in those layers of rock? There's a lot of different places we could go to take a look at why the Earth appears to be young. There are also a lot of places you can go to see why the Earth appears old. There is evidence for an ancient Earth. There is evidence for a young Earth. It's all God's evidence, and we are in the process of sorting it out. And I think when we have the Bible as part of our evidence, it helps to lend extra weight to the understanding that the Earth is young and make sense of some things that my old Earth colleagues and my old Earth evolutionary friends have some trouble with. And maybe we can point towards something that's better. So looking at these, I'm going to pick 4 of them, and we're going to move our way through that. We're going to take a look at some carbon-14 stuff. We're going to take a look at some really amazing preservation of fossils that still have things unexpected with them. Then we're going to take a look at what's called bioturbation and some fossil footprints. So, carbon-14 in ancient fossils. The first thing that we have to understand is how carbon-14 is made and why it's radioactive, and why it is that people can think that they can use this as a stopwatch, if you will, as a chronometer for time. So carbon-14 is actually formed in the atmosphere every day, all the time, by cosmic radiation coming from the sun that goes through a couple of chemical reactions resulting in a neutron. Remember your chemistry. Inside of a nucleus, you have protons and neutrons. So we've got this stray neutron that's flying through the atmosphere, and it collides with a molecule of nitrogen. And kind of like a set of billiard balls, the neutron hits and sticks, but it pops out a little proton from that nucleus, changing the identity of the atom from nitrogen into carbon. Because if you remember back to chemistry, the number of protons in your nucleus is your identity card, right? This is your driver's license. So as long as you've got 7 protons, you're nitrogen. But when this neutron pops one out, you become carbon-14. And you're going to do different bonds and things like that because carbon's a different atom than nitrogen is. Okay, so why is it radioactive? Well, it seems that there's now a bit too much of the neutrons in there. And we find that when we plot out radioactive materials, if you start getting a certain overabundance of neutrons in your nucleus, it seems the nucleus wants to make a switch. It wants to fix something, and it does that by jettisoning out particles from itself in various ways to try and reestablish a kind of harmony, a stability, if you will. But before that can happen, this carbon atom bonds with oxygen to form carbon dioxide. And then from carbon dioxide, it gets picked up by plants because that's what plants breathe in, right? Their respiration process takes in carbon dioxide, releases oxygen. And what do? Once they get that carbon dioxide in, well, they use it to make planty things. That's a science term. Right, planty stuff. What are some parts of plants? Audience participation time. Leaves. Roots. Pistils. All right, yeah, we're getting to parts of the flower, right? Stamen, stomata, right? Right, planty things include stems and roots and leaves and twigs and stuff, sap, right? I had some pancakes no, actually I had, what was it? Oatmeal this morning. I had some syrup. I had some plant sap. I don't think so. I think it was corn syrup. Anyway. So the plants take this carbon dioxide, they bring it in, they split it apart, and they take that carbon and they use it to build the other stuff inside the plant, which means that this radioactive carbon, which hasn't decayed yet but could at any moment, is now all throughout the plant world. How many of you had breakfast this morning? Okay. Most of the non-college students. All right. How many of you at least had dinner? Okay, now more of the hands go up. You fed yourself radioactive food. Nice job. Well done. Some of you are like, Dr. Ross, I ate at the Commons. I mean, we know. But that's funnier at Liberty. Anyway, you can't help it. Everywhere you go, all the food is contaminated with carbon-14. Now, it's not much. Eating it is not going to do any damage to your body. If it did, we'd all be dead. Because we all eat that. Because whether you are a vegetarian or not, if you eat the plants or eat the things that eat the plants, the whole biosphere has got carbon-14. And that carbon-14 decays over time. And by an interesting quirk, and it doesn't have to be this way, I think this is God having a bit of a sense of humor of all of this. The production rate of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by this process is almost the same rate as which carbon-14 eventually decays back into nitrogen by a totally different process, which means that your body is a bathtub. Bear with me. Your body is a bathtub that is filled with carbon-14. And as long as you are alive and eating, you get in carbon-14 from your food. And the whole time that you are getting carbon-14 from your food, you also lose a little bit of carbon-14 somewhere else in your body from decay. It turns into nitrogen, it goes away. So that means that as long as you're alive and eating, the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in your body stays the same. The level of the bathtub is the same because the spigot and the drain are going at the same rate. This is why carbon-14 is thought to be useful as a chronometer, because as soon as you die, you stop eating. Pretty sure that's true. But the carbon-14 that's in your body continues to decay, which means that over time, the amount of carbon-14 in your body goes down. So scientists then say, well, if I can measure this and compare it to where it started, and I know how fast the drain is going, then it's a simple math problem. If the train left Chicago at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, no, it's not, nobody likes those. But it's pretty simple algebra when it comes down to it. Now, the calculus that it took to get here, we don't even want to think about. That's no fun. But at this point, it becomes pretty simple math. Where do you go? Now, here's where it gets interesting, because people will say, okay, you can date this piece of pottery, or you can date this piece of charcoal, and it comes up with, 25,000 years ago. That seems a bit old. Geologists do not use carbon-14 to date rocks because rocks don't eat carbon dioxide for breakfast. Rocks don't have that interaction with the atmosphere that the plants do. So you can only date organic material, and you can only date things that might still have carbon-14 during the drain period. And carbon-14 decays pretty quick, so we don't use it for deep time geology stuff. We only use it for about the last, theoretically, 100,000 years, if the old Earth timescale were correct. But here's the thing, if the Earth is really ancient, which I don't think is correct, I think the Earth is young, then carbon-14 might actually be found in fossils of things that are supposed to be really ancient. Might be another way of dating that rock besides some of the other radioactive dating methods. And that's because all original carbon-14 values, sorry, that faded in the wrong point, all original carbon-14 should be gone if the fossil is tens or hundreds of millions of years old. The tub drains way too quick for that. But if the Earth is young, then it's quite possible that some original carbon-14 is still in there because there hasn't been that much time between the flood and today. So it turns out that there's quite a good bit of carbon-14 out in the geological world. There's stuff in petrified wood. There's stuff in shells. In fact, the petrified wood and the fossil shells were from the same rock unit. Dr. Andrew Snelling at Answers in Genesis did an analysis of this from some rocks in California. And what I find interesting about that is that the carbon-14 that's in the petrified wood and the fossil shells, they come out with about the same date, but you'd have to contaminate them in different ways because the carbon in wood is bound in different mineral structures than the ones in shells. So why are they both giving me the same date? You can't contaminate them in the same way. Vertebrate fossils, all of our fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, coal, always have a little bit of carbon-14 in them. It's not that much, but it's there, and that's the weird part. Even diamonds, which are supposed to be on the order of about 2 billion years in age, diamonds do not come from coal. That's a kind of geological misnomer. Superman crushes it in his hand, yes, but that's just Superman. But our diamonds are supposed to come from much earlier in Earth history, where basically bacterial muck gets brought down deep into the mantle, about 100 miles below our feet, and then gets brought up to the surface to make diamonds. And that's pretty interesting because actually the diamond that's formed 100 miles below our feet has got to get up to the surface in less than 3 days. Otherwise, it degrades into graphite along the way. And that's not something you put on a ring, guys. Bad decision, right? That's when she's just able to take the ring and write N-O, right? So take it from a geologist. Don't do this. So diamonds that are supposed to be even billions of years old have had radiocarbon recorded from them. And the one I like about that was it was a team of young Earth creationists working with the Institute for Creation Research and the Creation Research Society that decided to try to do a radioactive carbon date on a diamond. Nobody had ever thought to do it because if you're an old Earth geologist, there's no point. The diamond's 2 billion years old. There's no carbon-14 in it. The creationists, on the other hand, said, well, can you try? Sent it to the lab, and they said, well, we can try. And sure enough, they came up with 63,000 years on average, which I don't think the Earth is that old either. But again, the fact that there was carbon-14 is highly unexpected in an old Earth perspective. And depending on where the bathtub level started before the flood, we could actually explain that 60-some thousand years. Because in order to get a date, we're making an assumption of where the level of the bathtub was before the flood. And we may not know what that is. If it was much lower, then we're still measuring everything right. We're just making an assumption about the train leaving from Chicago at 4 and getting to New York. Well, what if it left from Philadelphia? You're making an assumption when that train left because you thought that it came from Chicago. That could be wrong. So those are the kind of likely reasons that we have for maybe why we get ages that are longer than maybe a few thousands of years old when I think the flood happened. Could be that the atmospheric carbon-14 production was actually lower. And so visually, again, we're assuming that it was up here when it was actually down here, and now it's moved a little bit, and we've said, oh yeah, that's lots and lots of time. And they're like, actually, it's not been much. So this carbon-14 within the fossil record seems to indicate that these fossils are young within these rocks that the geologists think are very, very old. They've dated them using different methods, but fossils that are thousands of years can't be inside rocks that are millions. So let's take a look at another issue, the preservation of original animal tissues in fossils. Now, I've been studying fossils for a while, and I got a chance to see a really great one in Dr. Snyder's lab, a T-Rex bone that had been bitten by another T-Rex. It's really cool. And that's that bone is mineral. It's rockish. It looks like a bone, but it's been mostly substituted with minerals so that most of the bone isn't there. But it turns out that there's some other things going on. So again, if the Earth is ancient, these materials that are inside of bones, things like cells, things like blood vessels, things like the gooey parts of your body, do not preserve. If the Earth is ancient, they should be unidentifiable because they degrade over time, even under the best conditions. You put something, for you cell and molecular biology people, you might have a -80 freezer in here. Put something down in that, it's going to stay put for a long, long time. It still degrades. The second law of thermodynamics does not stop in a freezer. Things still break down. But if the flood only happened a few thousands of years ago, it's quite possible that some of the materials inside of these bones could survive and hang around for a while before being completely obliterated. So in 2005, Mary Schweitzer, a paleontologist at North Carolina State University, shocked the entire world by reporting that there was gooey bits of stuff inside of her T-Rex bones. Fascinating story of discovery. They were working out in Montana, and they had a T-Rex femur. That's the leg bone. It's about this big, the upper leg bone, right? So the rest of it's a lot, too, you know. And the terrain was so rough and difficult that they couldn't bring a pickup truck down there to load the bone on, so they had to cut it in half and get it taken out by helicopter. That's kind of impressive. And she said to a science magazine later on that when they broke the bone, it smelled like rotting meat, which is not a pleasant smell, but also very intriguing when it's coming from a fossil that's supposed to be 68 million years old. So they patched the thing up, they brought it back to her lab. One of her graduate students was working on it, and she gave him a sample and said, I need you to demineralize this, which means that they're going to put it into an acid that's going to take away the mineral part of the bone and leave nothing but organic material. But he was only supposed to do this for a little while, just demineralize the outside. Well, he forgot about it, he left it overnight, and all the mineral in the bone went away. And he brought the petri dish to her and basically saying, sorry, I dissolved your fossil. Now, thankfully, it wasn't the whole femur, right? It's just a little bit. And yet, when they looked at it, there was stuff still there, which there shouldn't be. And they looked under a microscope, and they started realizing that they had what looked like blood vessels. And so, rather than yelling at her graduate student, she said, do it again. Right? Good scientific procedure. Repeat. It's like the laundry. Repeat. And she said, if we get this a second time, we'll call Jim, or Jack Horner out in Montana. And it worked again. And there was gooey stuff. What kind of gooey stuff? So, that qualifies as gooey stuff. These are branching blood vessels. And you'll notice that inside some of them, there are these little circles. Sure look like blood cells. Now, they may or may not be, but they are iron-rich balls. They did pull them out and do a chemical assay on them. Found that they are iron-rich, which is what you'd expect for red blood cells. They're also spherical, which our red blood cells are not. Does anybody know why our red blood cells are not spherical? What are they lacking? Very good. Nucleus, right? Mammal red blood cells are non-nucleated. Reptilian, avian, and amphibian ones are. These are spherical and iron-rich. Well, it turns out the T-Rex isn't the only one that had this happen. Schweitzer went out and was collecting fossils in a different rock layer in Montana, deeper down, and found that a duck-billed dinosaur had similar sorts of stuff. Oops, sorry. So here is the image of what they have. Again, one of these branching blood vessels, and they zoom in and they take a look at this, and this seems to be a cell, or several cells. See all these little filamentous bits coming off of them? It's a certain type of cell that is responsible for building bone. We call them osteoblasts and osteocytes. Yes, a couple of people are like, oh, yes. And they're always located next to blood vessels because they need a substantial amount of nutrients in order to secrete the minerals that make bone. So they're always found at these juncture points, and she compared that to the types of structures that they find in ostriches. So she took some ostrich bone and put it under a SEM, and found there's the branch site, and there's the cell, and there's the cell, and it looks a heck of a lot like those. Looks like they found actual dinosaur cells. They kept working. Her name just keeps popping up, because she's making all these amazing discoveries. She's not the only one now, but she's continued to work very hard to discover this sort of stuff and also to try and come up with a chemistry that might preserve them for tens of millions of years because she is an evolutionist and thinks the Earth is ancient. I don't think she's going to be successful in that, but I do give her great credit because she's been doing a lot of very interesting research to try and see how you can possibly fix these things so that they don't degrade. Because honestly, I wasn't expecting these either. My expectations as a paleontologist was bones are replaced by minerals. Young Earth creationists didn't anticipate this discovery. We only have a slightly better chance of explaining it because our timeline is shorter. Much, much shorter. These little dots are fluorescent markers. And again, I keep coming across our cell biology sorts of things. Antibodies are structures that we bind to proteins, right? And antibodies are tremendously specific. You can make an antibody for one particular protein in the world, and that's it. This is why pregnancy tests will tell you that they are 99.99% accurate, because the antibody in a pregnancy test will only come up with a little plus line if the hormone from pregnancy is present in the female. So if that little plus line comes up, you can go to the doctor, he'll give you a pregnancy test, you'll get a little plus line again, 99.99% accuracy. If it says yes, it's yes. So what they did is they made antibodies for vertebrate-specific proteins. They wanted to rule out the possibility of bacterial contamination here, that maybe bacteria infested the dinosaur bone at some point in the past. And so these little markers indicate the places where vertebrate-specific proteins are tagged in the fossil. No bacteria, vertebrate material, original dinosaur proteins are here. So tissues, protein, and DNA, we know decay rapidly over time. Even in those minus 80s, even in those freezers, there is a horizon after which this stuff becomes gooish gel. There's nothing structural remaining out of it. So the preservation of these things indicates that we are in front of that horizon. And that horizon for most of these proteins is well under a couple of million years, under best scenarios of being at nearly absolute zero, which in the rock record you never get to on Earth. In fact, if nothing else, in places like Montana, the further you go down into the rocks, the warmer things start to get once you get past the immediate surface. So cold temperatures aren't going to help you because the rocks have been warm for a very, very long time. And with extra heat, you're going to have extra decay. Two other topics: footprints. And for these two topics, this one and for bioturbation, I tip my hat to Drs. Art Chadwick and Leonard Brand and their book, Faith, Reason, and Earth History. Art Chadwick and Leonard Brand are both Seventh-day Adventists. Art Chadwick teaches at Southwestern Adventist University, and Leonard Brand just retired from Loma Linda University, where he's still doing research because he's a busy man. He loves being outside in God's creation. And the two of them are responsible for most of what I'm about to present over here, so I want to make sure that they're given due credit. So trackways are interesting. Like when an animal walks around in sediment, it will leave tracks. You go out to the beach, you walk around, you leave tracks. And if the sand is dry, you don't leave much that's discernible. You leave little pad imprints. If the sand is moist, you leave much more discernible footprints. If it's sopping wet, then you kind of goop your way through the mud. Right? Well, that happens to animals as well. So here we have an illustration of a little trilobite. These are little underwater bug-like fossil critters. They're really fun. I love trilobites. They're neat. They roll up like pill bugs when they get scared. And so there's a whole bunch of enrolled trilobites in the fossil record because they're like, flood, and sorry, they didn't make it. But they're at my house now, so that's good. So we've got a couple of different types of fossils. Body fossils refer to the things like the trilobite and the dinosaur bones and stuff. But then we also have other types of fossils that we have like, I'm getting ahead of myself. But the nice thing about the body fossils is that they're abundant and they're durable. And that's important when we think about the conundrum that we're going to see here in a moment, is that body fossils have a higher tendency of being preserved because they're hard bits and pieces. They resist erosion and weathering. Tracks, on the other hand, are merely records of movement, behavior. You can see different trails of animals or worms or things like that, and you can get an idea of how they behave by the imprints and the tracks that they've left behind. But the tracks are more rare, right? Because very special circumstances are needed in order to preserve them. You've got to have an animal scurry around, and then you've got to be able to cover that track with more sediment before it gets obliterated, right? Before it gets stirred up and missed around. So they're more delicate. And so as a result, if the Earth is ancient, you would expect that body fossils and track fossils would be distributed, first off, fairly randomly, but with a higher preponderance of the body fossils because, after all, they're hard bits. And the trackways would probably be interspersed pretty randomly. So if T-Rex is found in this layer and this layer, chances are you're going to find some foot tracks once in a while with it. Okay. So, oops, sorry, there's all that stuff. But sometimes we find out that there is presumably, on an old Earth time scale, millions of years of difference between the trackways of a group of organisms and their first appearance as physical fossils and body pieces of shells and teeth and bones and stuff. So, for example, trilobites. The first trilobite fossils that we have are not trilobites, they're trilobite trackways. And the best location in which this has been studied in Canada, where there's a lot of, about 10,000 feet worth of strata that have been deposited. And it's very, very obvious that the trackways are coming before the trilobites. Well, how is that possible? Because you have to have a trilobite body to make trilobite tracks. You can't make trilobite tracks without a jointed exoskeleton like an arthropod. The first amphibian body fossils are found 30 million years above our first amphibian trackways. That's really weird. You have to have feet to make a footprint. So where are the feet? Well, they're apparently 30 million years late to the party. That doesn't work. Turtle bodies are found 25 million years after turtle tracks, which is really weird because turtles don't move fast, last I checked. So I'm really kind of, what's going on with this? Even in a flood sort of thing, like, that's a big difference. Picked up, float around for a little while. And even when it comes to dinosaurs, dinosaur body fossils are found a little bit after the tracks, and we find really large dinosaur footprints somewhat earlier than we find the actual large dinosaurs as we work our way up in the rock units. So if the Earth is young, though, and sediments are forming rapidly during the flood, and organisms are trying to escape the flood, this makes sense, because there isn't that much time. There isn't 30 million years between this and this. There's 3 weeks. It's a lot easier to envision hours and days between the trackway production and the burial during Noah's flood than it is to think that the trilobites were hanging around and not getting preserved for 10 million years, aside from where they walked. So rapid sedimentation, rapid buildup of these sedimentary rocks during the flood is able to accommodate this kind of idea where we've got a short duration. They flee, and they're later caught by floodwaters and deposited in the sediments over top of them. It's the type of pattern that is hard to explain from an old Earth perspective, and one that finds a natural explanation within the flood. This does not mean that evolution is wrong. This doesn't mean that we have won and defeated and we can all go home now. This is an evidence, it's an argument, and there's more to find. Far more to find. Last one, bioturbation, when organisms stir up the sediment. So if you go out into the ocean and you spend 3 hours down over here, you'll die. No. Students in my classes learn all different sorts of ways that ye might die while listening to Dr. Ross drone on about stuff. But out in the oceans today, there are lots and lots of critters meandering around the sediment. And whenever there's a really big storm, a nor'easter, a hurricane, or something like that, those storms make really nice, fine, laminated deposits, layers of stuff. It might be this thick, but inside it you have all these nice little layers. And all the organisms during this event, they're being tossed around by the waves, and eventually they settle back down, and the first thing that they do is dig. And they dig to find any food that might still be inside that set of layers. And within a couple of days, couple of weeks, there are no more layers anymore because the organisms just move around looking for food. Okay. So bioturbation is all about organisms, in this case something like a clam, shrimp, worms, going through and constantly just working through the sediment over here. This is a picture from Dr. Brandon Chadwick's book showing some of the different types of structures that we find of organisms when they do this sort of thing. You might have these U-shaped burrows from clams. You might have trilobite crossing marks and things like that. So here's a picture of the top of a rock that has been heavily bioturbated. It's got a lot of stuff all over it. But most of the rocks that we find in the rock record look more like this. Lots of fine laminations, lots of fine layers, occasional bioturbation. This stuff is much more rare, which is weird if the Earth is ancient and processes in the past look much like they do today, because it doesn't take very long to bioturbate and get rid of all these layers today. So organisms tunnel around the floor looking for food, worms, shrimp, and clams. And if the Earth is ancient, there shouldn't be very many fine layered sediments. And yet there are lots and lots of them. It's another indicator that things are happening too fast for organisms to catch up. Organisms are running away and leaving tracks and being buried in short order on top of them. Organisms that usually bioturbate are not being given that much of a chance because within the next several hours, there's another layer of sediment coming and depositing on top of them, trapping them under pressure so they can't go anywhere. And so you end up with lots of layers. You end up with layers that have fossils and layers that don't have anybody doing anything, and yet the fossils are right there. How come they didn't bioturbate down into this unit? They should have. If we go into the modern estuary of something like Chesapeake Bay today, under average conditions, a 1 meter by 1 meter grid with a bunch of fine layers will be bioturbated within 2 hours. There's no time that's being shown in the fossil record with this issue. So as we look at these sorts of things, we have evidence from carbon-14 that indicates that we've got young fossils in rocks that my colleagues think are really old, that we have the preservation of original biotissues inside some of these fossils that have a horizon of degrade that's not very long, and yet we still have them, so they've got to be younger still. We have evidence from trackways and bioturbation that indicates that there's very little time in the fossil record that's being represented at all. All of these are things that are consistent and consonant with a young Earth and flood perspective. They might not be impossible hurdles for my evolutionary colleagues to get over. They might have counter-arguments, and we must consider those. But at the same time, these are good arguments for a rapid deposition of the geological column in short sequence not very long ago. A global flood comports well with both the biblical text and with the fossil record. So, if you remember anything out of all of this, we've got gooey things when we shouldn't. We've got C14 in places when we shouldn't. And we've got too many things happening too quickly to be accounted for by deep time. And if you can remember those three little things, then I would count tonight a pretty big success. Now, Dr. Snyder also reminded me that I needed to make a pitch for two things. One, I have a textbook on earth science and geology, co-authored with two colleagues at Cedarville University and one colleague at Answers in Genesis, Dr. Danny Faulkner. And so if you're interested in geology at all, getting yourself a copy of this book entitled The Heavens and the Earth would be a great place to start, where we talk about creation issues. We also attempt as best we can to fairly represent my evolutionary and old Earth colleagues as well. And our website, cornerstoneedsupply.com, my wife and I started Cornerstone 5 years ago, 4 years now that we've been open, and we began with, well, I do what I know, right? Rock, mineral, and fossil kits is where we got ourselves started. Since then, we've expanded out into some other areas, and we're expanding out into biology. We service homeschool co-ops a lot. If you've heard of Classical Conversations, we do a lot with them. But for private schools that are looking for dissection supplies, looking for rock kits, things like that, we've got them. And the reason that I started this company was not so much that I could make myself rich, because that's probably not going to happen. But I wanted to be able to create a company that could produce educational materials in geology that affirmed young Earth. And that space was unoccupied. In ecology, we'd say this is an unoccupied niche, right? There needed to be something in there that could help people understand, like that little geologic column that you've got in there that goes with all of our kits, so that people can understand the idea of getting the data, interpreting the data, the tentative nature of models, and yet consistency with the biblical text. And what we do with this is, I mean, it's a company, it's not a ministry or things like that. We are a for-profit company, but part of our profits then go to help fund creation research. The whole point for me doing this was so that other creationists that I know that need research money to go out and hit rocks with hammers or look under a microscope can get some money to do that, so that we can fund students who want to work with professors who are doing creation research. So look for Cornerstone Educational Supply, not so much for the materials that you need, though if you do need them, let me know. But look for us to help the creation community. That is our goal. And that is the end of my talk tonight. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. And let me check with our MC in the back. How much time? A couple of questions? All right, so I've got a mic over here. Can we turn this one on for anybody who might have a question? I'll just hand this to you, and you can hand it to whoever.
What are your opinions on theories such as antediluvians performing genetic experiments to create their own dinosaur species, and the backing that those theories receive from Ellen White texts and the Bible, using terms like beast amalgamation?
It's a good question. As someone who was not raised within the SDA, I don't know a whole lot within this area. And so I'd rather probably table that one. As the old phrase goes, best to leave one's mouth shut and be thought a fool than to open it and leave no doubt.
Yeah, I have a question about the T-Rex and the live tissue. What do
Yes.
your colleagues who don't believe in creation, like, how do they interpret that?
Great question. I remember my PhD advisor, it was after I'd left, and we got back together and we were at another presentation about this, and he liked it. He thought this was neat. Now, when this was first presented at the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, I was told, I wasn't there, that there were audible gasps in the audience, much like yours, but even more because Schweitzer showed a video of her using a pair of tweezers to pull the tissue and see the blood vessels snap back into place. So we're talking about pliable tissues. Yeah. And that dropped everybody's jaw. Yeah. So Schweitzer has been on the hunt now for a chemistry that is going to be able to fix, if you will, like formaldehyde, fix these materials in perpetuity, right? So that if we have the right kind of chemistry, we're going to be able to maintain this structure for tens, hundreds of millions of years. She's made some interesting progress along that line, showing that iron is going to be able to bind some of these materials, and even leaving some of this stuff out on a shelf in her window in front of the sun for 2 years, and then going back and sequencing and seeing that there's been no change. So she's made some impressive work on that.
And does that change their interpretation of when in time the T-Rex was alive? Or?
Not directly. So for Schweitzer, she's saying, I gotta get this material to survive for 68 million years. And I've so far gotten it to survive unchanged for 2. Oh. So we have a couple of orders of magnitude worth of time to work out here. But also, looking through her paper that developed this particular chemistry, what you had to do in order to get this to work would never occur in the natural world. We're talking about centrifuging material on, I believe, 5 different occasions. So that's putting it in one of those little spinny devices that goes at like 70,000 RPM, and doing that on at least 5 different occasions during the process, purifying things and whatnot, situations that in nature you don't have at your disposal. Mm-hmm. And so while she shows some good progress that iron can bind and maybe slow this down, there's no way that you could get what she did in the lab to happen inside the T-Rex bone itself. Okay. So there's still, I think, very little hope at the moment. But that's my opinion on it. So.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. This is the part where I get to look awkwardly at everyone and smile. We have a question over here. I can hear you, and I'll just repeat the question.
I just wondered about fossil fuels. I sort of refuse to use that term because I think they're drilling petroleum much deeper than fossils have ever been found. Is that true?
Okay, good question. Basically, where do we get our fossil fuels? Or is that a good term to use for it even? You refuse to use it. That's fine. You can just call it oil, right? You know, that'll work. Gas. I'll just say I'll disagree on that one. That though we do find our petroleum reserves, how about that? Petroleum reserves in very deep areas, and there's also some shallow ones. Chemical analysis shows that the carbon signature that we get from those mirrors very closely the types of carbon signatures that we get out of algae. And so while we sometimes think, that oil comes from squished dinosaurs, the reality is that oil and natural gas are coming from algae-based materials, whereas coal, of course, is coming from plants. And that one's a lot easier to see because you can see bits and pieces of plant in the coal, so that one's not as much of an issue. But when it does come to the petroleum stuff and natural gas, we seem to have a very, very strong signature of microbial origins, which within a flood I can envision happening pretty easily if you have lots of nutrients that are flowing in during these erosion events. We know that nutrients like iron and phosphorus are limiting agents in the open ocean. If you infuse the ocean with these types of minerals, if you will, then you can create massive blooms of algae that can then be deposited within the sediments, baked and heated and brought up to the temperatures necessary to produce something like crude oil. So that would be my approach to that one. Sure. Yes, sir.
How do you, if you believe in a young Earth, how do you deal with the old age of the rocks?
Very good question. And I skipped that one here tonight, didn't I? Wonder why. It's hard. The honest answer is radioactive dating of the rocks using things like uranium, strontium, technically rubidium, and some of the other methods. Carbon-14 is only used for organic materials in what's supposed to be the recent past, very recent past. And we use different radioactive materials to date rocks, particularly the igneous and the metamorphic rocks and the ash deposits. So since I was talking about fossils, I skipped over those. And that is a very hard question for young Earth creationists because when you're talking about how fast a radioisotope decays, like uranium eventually into lead, you're talking about equations that have at their root some of the fundamental constants that hold the universe together. And so tweaking them means that you could also have deleterious problems in the rest of the universe. So you've got to be careful about how you decide to play with physics, theoretically at that. Nonetheless, I think that there are some good indications within the rocks that perhaps the radioactive dates that point towards billions of years or hundreds of millions of years also have signatures in them that are telling us of thousands of years. If you wouldn't mind, I can pull up one slide that might be able to help with that. I think I've got one ready here. Let's see. This will help. It's almost like I knew that was coming, but well, I'm not a Calvinist, so it wasn't predestination. But anyway, so when we're thinking about uranium decay, uranium, when it is used to date a granite, for example, granites have several different minerals in them. One of them is biotite mica. Biotite is a shiny, black, very flaky mineral that's very, very soft, and it'll make these little black flecks in your granite. In between the layers of those flakes of biotite are occasionally very tiny crystals called zirconium silicate, or zircons. Zircons grow by adding zirconium and oxygen and silicon in a regular pattern in order to create the crystal structure. But every once in a while, uranium gets put in instead of the zirconium because they're about the same size and they have the same charge. So it's kind of like having a Lego structure and occasionally you have a blue Lego instead of a red one that gets put in. Now, you don't have any connects and you don't have any other stuff, no Lincoln logs. Nobody plays with those anyway, right? So you're building your crystal out of Legos and occasionally you have a substitution of the type of the color of Lego. So the reason that's important is because the uranium is unstable and will decay, and over time that uranium will decay down into lead, and it does so usually through about a dozen different processes, but 8 of them are what we call alpha decays, where in the nucleus spits out 2 protons and 2 neutrons. That's basically a helium atom. Okay? Think of helium on the far end of your periodic table, and the neat thing about helium is it's one of the noble gases. It doesn't react with anybody or anything. It just leaves, goes away. It makes your voice sound weird, right? So helium is able to escape. And this is where we come to a potential rejoinder from the young Earth approach compared to an old Earth one. So the same group that was looking at carbon-14 in diamonds, the rate group, was also looking at uranium and zircons. And if we take a look at the amount of uranium and the amount of lead, it looks like the crystal has been decaying for about, in this case, 1.5 billion years. pretty good long trajectory. And because we know that this type of uranium always makes this type of lead, and along the way it makes 8 helium atoms, we can also estimate how much helium was inside the crystal over time. But since the helium escapes so well, it's supposed to be able to just get out of the crystal. That'll be determined on the basis of how big the crystal is. The smaller the crystal, the quicker you find the edge. And the temperature. The higher the temperature, the faster you find the edge. So what the Young Earth Creation Group, the RATE team, did is they sampled the zircon and asked the question, well, how much helium is still in here? And what they found is that most of the helium was still inside the crystal. And yet helium is an outstanding escaper, if you will. We actually use it to detect leaks in scientific equipment because it can get out of even the tiniest little cracks. And so knowing how big the crystals are, knowing their temperatures, we were able to plot out, my creation colleagues were able to plot out what the expectation would be, and they also, Russ Humphreys, made a prediction: if the Earth is young, this is how much helium should still be in there. When they came out with their final results 5 years later, Russ Humphreys was dead on correct. Dead on correct that there was only about 4,000 years worth of helium loss from all of the helium that seemed to have been made over 1.5 billion years, leading these scientists to think that perhaps the rate of decay of uranium into lead has been much faster in the past, piling up the helium inside that has not had enough time to escape just yet. So, like some of my other arguments here, this does not destroy old Earth geology. This does not answer all the questions of radioactive decay. But it shows two things. One, something that is consistent with a young Earth. But second, it also points out that creationists, using the Bible as part of their evidence, can jump off with hypotheses from that, test the world, and come back with results that are of interest. That is what science is for. It's amazing because in the history and philosophy of science, when we take a look at it, where one gets a hypothesis is not a scientific point. You can get a hypothesis from anything. My favorite example of this is the discovery of benzene. Because the person who discovered the circular structure of benzene was staring into his fire, and he said he fell into something like a trance. This starts getting really weird. That's why it's my favorite example. It's bizarre. And as he watched the flames in this trance-like hallucinogenic state, he saw the flames wrap up like a snake and begin to coil around upon itself. And later on, he kind of like wakes up from this weird little fog that he had, and he thinks, what if benzene is a ring? Nobody had ever thought of carbon in a structure of a ring before. That's not the way carbon behaved. It was chains. He thought, what about a ring? Now, is there anything scientific about the little trippy event that he had? No. We need to talk to somebody. We need some counseling going on here, right? So the generation of a hypothesis does not require some sort of scientific sort of thing. The question of the hypothesis is, can you go to the natural world and can you test it? And if you can, it is scientific. Cool. So creationists operating within a creationist framework can ask and answer interesting types of questions. So that would be one issue, but there are many more when it comes to radioactive dating. A lot of other issues with that. Question in the back, or a point.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to
All right.
stop there. But let's
Thank you
our
so
speaker
much,
one more
and thank
time,
you for the
Dr.
questions.
Marcus Ross.
Appreciate it. Thank you.